The night was calm, and the streets were almost empty. A cool wind blew across the city, carrying the sound of faraway traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Street lights glowed with a dull yellow shine, making long shadows stretch across the road. It was the kind of night when most people were at home resting, but not everyone had that luxury. A young woman named Claire was driving her car back home after a long day. She worked in a field that demanded sharp focus and calmness under pressure. On the outside, she looked like any other ordinary woman. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, her clothes were simple but stylish, and her eyes held a mix of intelligence and quiet strength. To strangers, she was just another driver passing through the night. But unknown to others, Claire was more than she appeared. She carried secrets that no one could guess by looking at her. In her bag, hidden carefully beneath some papers, was her CIA identification card. She had spent years in training, mastering the skills of observation, quick thinking, and handling dangerous situations. Yet, despite her powerful background, she moved through the world quietly, never revealing who she really was unless it became necessary. That night, Claire's thoughts were on her work, on the reports she had to review, and on the phone call she needed to make before the morning. She wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. But sometimes, life throws unexpected challenges when you least expect them. As she drove down a quiet stretch of road, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A police car was right behind her, signaling for her to pull over. Claire immediately slowed down and guided her car to the side of the road. She rolled down her window slightly and waited calmly. She knew the proper way to handle police stops. Even though she had nothing to hide, she always believed in staying composed. A tall officer stepped out of the patrol car and walked toward her. His uniform looked crisp under the streetlights, his boots tapping against the pavement with authority. To an ordinary eye, he looked like a man of the law, someone sworn to protect and serve. But his face carried a certain arrogance, and his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have. "Good evening," the officer said as he leaned slightly toward her window. His tone wasn't warm or professional, it was sharp, almost commanding. "Good evening, officer," Claire replied politely, her voice steady. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked. "I'm not sure, officer," she said honestly. "I believe I wasn't speeding." He smirked slightly. "Well, sometimes it's not just about speed. Sometimes it's about safety." His words hung in the air, vague and unsettling. Claire stayed calm. She had been in far more dangerous situations before, though not in this kind of setting. Her instincts told her that something about this officer was not right. His eyes were not those of a man checking for traffic violations, they were the eyes of someone trying to assert unnecessary control. He asked for her license and registration. Claire handed them over without hesitation. He took his time looking at them, longer than necessary, as if searching for something more than just information. Then, instead of returning them, he leaned closer. "You're out pretty late," he said in a low voice. "What's a woman like you doing out here all alone?" Claire's heart remained steady, though her mind sharpened instantly. She recognized the tone. This wasn't routine. She knew the signs of someone abusing their position. But outwardly, she kept her expression neutral. She simply answered, "I was on my way home from work." The officer gave a short laugh. "Work, huh? Must be tiring. Maybe you should be more careful. A lot of things can happen out here at night." She didn't reply. Instead, she observed. The way he stood, the way his hand rested on the edge of her car door, the way he was trying to intimidate her. She kept her breathing slow, her eyes focused. She didn't want to reveal her true strength too early. After a pause, the officer handed back her documents but didn't step away. "You know," he said, "I could give you a hard time tonight. I could write you a ticket, maybe even more. But, maybe we can work something out." His smile was thin and insincere. Claire understood his meaning. She had encountered people who tried to exploit others before, though rarely in uniform. She knew she had to think carefully. She couldn't act rashly and reveal her identity, not yet. Instead, she played along, her face showing no fear. "I appreciate your concern, officer," she said quietly. "But I think I'll just be on my way now." He narrowed his eyes, sensing her calm resistance. For a moment, he seemed uncertain. But his pride pushed him further. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, trying to intimidate her into submission. Claire's mind worked quickly. She knew every word, every move he made would become evidence later. She shifted her bag slightly, pressing the small button on her phone that began recording audio. Without drawing attention, she also memorized his badge number, etched clearly on his uniform. Minutes felt like hours as the officer tried to push his power. Claire didn't argue, didn't show fear, but inside she was building a case against him. She knew this encounter was going to end very differently than he imagined. Finally, after his attempts failed to break her calmness, he gave a forced smile and stepped back. "Drive safe," he muttered, as if he was the one granting mercy. Claire nodded politely, though her eyes remained sharp. She drove off slowly, leaving him standing under the streetlight. He probably believed he had unsettled her, that he had left a mark of fear. But in truth, the opposite had happened. She now had everything she needed to bring his actions into the light. As she drove away, her mind was steady. She knew how to handle people like him. She knew the right way to use her training, not through confrontation on the street, but through patience, intelligence, and the law. For the officer, it was just another night where he thought he could misuse his authority. For Claire, it was the beginning of a plan. She would not let this go. She had the skills, the proof, and the determination. And though he didn't know it yet, the officer had just crossed paths with the one woman who could end his career and more. Claire drove home that night with her mind working like a machine. On the outside, she looked calm, but inside, she was already building a plan. Years of training had taught her that no wrong act should go unnoticed, especially when it came from someone who carried a badge. A badge was meant to protect, not to frighten. When she reached her apartment, she locked the door, set her bag on the table, and carefully pulled out her phone. She replayed the recording she had made during the traffic stop. The officer's voice was clear, his tone sharp, his words full of arrogance. Every second was captured. She wrote down notes in a small notebook she always kept near her work desk. She listed his badge number, his patrol car number, the exact time and location of the stop, and even his physical description. She didn't miss a single detail. To her, every detail was a weapon not of violence, but of truth. Claire wasn't an ordinary citizen. She was a CIA agent, trained to see beyond the surface. She had worked on cases involving corruption, smuggling, and organized crime. She knew how small cracks in the system could grow into something dangerous if not stopped early. This wasn't just about her safety that night, it was about the bigger picture. If this officer could misuse his power on her, how many others had already faced the same? And how many would suffer again if he wasn't stopped? The next morning, she walked into her office building with her usual calmness. Her colleagues greeted her with respect, but none of them knew about what had happened the night before. Claire had learned long ago to separate her personal feelings from her work. She never rushed into things. Instead, she handled them step by step. She entered a quiet, restricted room where classified information was handled. After logging into the secure system, she began typing her report. She didn't describe herself as the victim, she wrote it as a professional report of misconduct, attaching the audio evidence as proof. She explained the events clearly, with times, dates, and official observations. Her language was sharp, precise, and free of emotion. She knew that was how reports got taken seriously. When she was finished, she encrypted the file and sent it to a special internal CIA unit that focused on law enforcement misconduct tied to larger networks. This unit often looked at cases where corruption in police ranks connected with gangs, drugs, or illegal deals. She didn't know yet if this officer was linked to such things, but her instincts told her it was possible. His behavior had not been random, it came from a mindset that believed he was above accountability. Meanwhile, the officer from that night carried on with his life as if nothing had happened. His name was Officer Daniels. He was young, ambitious, and often thought of himself as untouchable. He had been with the department for only a few years, but he had already built a reputation not of honor, but of boldness. Some of his fellow officers liked him for his confidence, while others quietly disliked his arrogance. In his mind, what happened with Claire was nothing unusual. He had told himself that he was just teaching her a lesson for being out late. He laughed about it the next day when he met a fellow officer for coffee. "You should have seen her face," he said with a grin. "I had her nervous. These people don't realize we can do whatever we want out there." His colleague didn't laugh. Instead, he shook his head. "You better be careful, Daniels. One day you're gonna push the wrong person." Daniels waved off the warning. "Please. I know who I can push and who I can't. Trust me, I've got this under control." But he was wrong. The woman he had targeted was not a helpless driver. She was someone who carried a shield stronger than his badge, a shield of federal authority and justice. And the storm was already forming around him, though he had no idea. Back at the CIA office, Claire's report didn't sit untouched. Within hours, it was flagged by a supervisor and passed to a small team for review. The audio was played, the officer's details were checked against existing records, and soon, a file began to grow. What they discovered surprised even the investigators. Officer Daniels already had minor complaints on his record, citizens reporting rude behavior, unnecessary stops, and improper conduct. None of them had led to serious punishment, but together they painted a troubling picture. Now, with Claire's evidence, the unit saw a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Claire stayed silent through it all. She didn't brag about her involvement, didn't share the story with anyone around her. She knew the importance of patience. She also knew that Daniels, in his arrogance, probably believed he had scared her into silence. That thought almost made her smile. One evening, while reviewing unrelated documents at her desk, Claire received a message from the internal unit: "Your report is under active investigation. We will update you as developments occur." She leaned back in her chair, her eyes steady. The process had begun. She had planted the seed, and now it would grow. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels continued on his routine. He drove the same streets, wore the same uniform, and carried the same careless confidence. He didn't notice that sometimes, unmarked cars followed at a distance. He didn't see the subtle shift in how some of his colleagues treated him with caution. He lived in the illusion that he was safe, while the net around him slowly tightened. Days turned into a week. Claire kept to her life, outwardly untouched. She went to work, exercised in the mornings, read books in the evenings, and called her family on weekends. But deep inside, she was preparing for the next step. She knew the time would come when Daniels would be confronted, and she would be there to face him, not as the quiet woman in the car, but as the agent of truth he never expected. For Daniels, the silence was his comfort. He thought silence meant victory. He thought she had driven away that night and left her fear on the road. He didn't know that silence, in the right hands, was power. And that silence was about to break in the most shocking way. A week later, Officer Daniels walked into the station with the same swagger he always carried. He greeted a few colleagues with casual confidence, joking about his night shift and how quiet the streets had been. To him, everything was normal. The world was still under his control. But behind the scenes, things were no longer the same. A special unit had already begun building a file on him. His late-night activities, his complaints from the past, and now Claire's powerful report were all stacked together like bricks forming a wall. The investigation was quiet, hidden from his eyes, but it was moving with precision. That morning, Daniels was called into the captain's office. He thought it was for routine paperwork. The captain's face was unreadable as he said, "You've been requested to attend a departmental inquiry this afternoon. Be in conference room B at 3 o'clock sharp." Daniels frowned but didn't worry. "Sure thing, Captain. Probably just another review," he said, brushing it off. He had attended small inquiries before, and nothing serious had come of them. He believed this would be the same. When the time came, he walked into conference room B with his chest out, still confident. But as soon as he opened the door, his smile faded. The room wasn't filled with his fellow officers. Instead, there were men in suits, federal suits. They sat at a long table, their faces calm and serious. Their eyes didn't carry the casual look of local staff, they carried authority. At the center of the table sat Claire. Daniels froze for a second, his steps faltering. His eyes widened as recognition hit him. The woman from the car. The woman he thought he had intimidated. She wasn't just another citizen. She wasn't someone he could push aside and forget. She sat there with quiet strength, her posture straight, her eyes locked on him. Daniels tried to recover, forcing a weak smile. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice losing some of its edge. One of the men in suits spoke firmly. "Officer Daniels, take a seat." He sat down slowly, glancing around. The air in the room was thick. He could feel the weight of authority pressing against him. His heart began to pound, though he tried not to show it. Claire reached into her bag and placed something on the table. It was a small leather badge holder. She flipped it open, revealing the CIA identification card. The letters seemed to glow under the fluorescent light. Daniel's throat went dry. His face turned pale. He leaned back in his chair as if he had just seen a ghost. "You," he stammered. "You're yes," Claire said calmly, cutting him off. Her voice was steady, professional. "I am not who you thought I was. That night, you abused your position of power. And every word, every move, was recorded." She reached across the table and pressed a button on a small device. The audio from that night filled the room. Daniel's own voice echoed back at him, the sharp tone, the arrogance, the threats disguised as warnings. The sound of his laugh was like a knife in his own ears now. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "Listen, this isn't what it sounds like," he muttered. "You don't understand." Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "No, Officer Daniels. I understand perfectly. You thought you had power over me. You thought I would walk away in silence. But I don't walk away from injustice." The men in suits nodded as she continued. She laid out the evidence one by one, the time, the location, his badge number, the recording, and his pattern of behavior. Each point landed like a hammer. Daniel's confidence crumbled piece by piece. For the first time in a long time, he felt fear. Not the fear of losing a single case or getting a small punishment, but the fear of everything collapsing: his badge, his career, his reputation, his freedom. He tried again, his voice shaky. "Look, maybe I crossed a line, but I didn't mean any harm. I was just joking around." Claire's eyes remained steady. "You don't joke with authority. You don't joke with people's safety. And you don't joke with the law." The silence in the room after her words was heavy. Daniels glanced at the captain, hoping for support, but the captain's face showed no sympathy. He looked disappointed, even ashamed. The federal team began asking him questions. Simple ones at first, but each question had a purpose. Where were you that night? Why did you stop her? Why did your words contradict your written report? Daniel stumbled with every answer, his voice betraying him. He was no longer the officer in control, he was the man cornered. Claire didn't interrupt, didn't argue. She simply observed, her presence alone reminding him of the truth he had tried to bury. At one point, Daniels broke into a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. Come on, guys, you're making this bigger than it is. She's making me look like some kind of criminal. She isn't making you look like anything, one of the agents replied coldly. You did that yourself. The words hit him hard. He lowered his eyes, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time, the weight of his actions truly settled on him. In that moment, Daniels realized the full mistake he had made. It wasn't just about that night, it was about all the nights he had carried himself with arrogance, all the times he thought the badge gave him permission to bend rules. And now, standing against him, was a woman he had underestimated, a woman with more power, more evidence, and more authority than he could ever have. Claire leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but final. You had a choice that night. You chose corruption over duty. And now you must face the consequences. Daniels didn't reply. He couldn't. His mouth felt dry, his voice gone. Panic had taken over completely. The session ended with the agents collecting all documents and telling Daniels that he would be contacted for further disciplinary and legal action. As he left the room, his steps were heavy, his head spinning. The world that once made him feel untouchable now felt like a cage closing in. Behind him, Claire gathered her things with calm precision. She wasn't proud or boastful. To her, this was not about revenge, it was about justice. And justice, she knew, always had its moment. For Daniels, the revelation was crushing. The woman he had once tried to intimidate had turned out to be the very force that could destroy his career. He had played a dangerous game, and now the truth had caught up with him. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. Officer Daniels walked out of the conference room with his heart pounding so hard that he could almost hear it echo in his ears. His once steady steps now felt heavy, like his boots were made of stone. His hands trembled slightly as he held the folder they had given him, though he didn't even remember what was inside. His mind was spinning in every direction, unable to focus. He had thought he was untouchable. For years, he had carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed nothing could ever bring him down. But now, after seeing Claire place her CIA badge on that table, he felt stripped of everything: his authority, his power, even his pride. The words she had spoken in that calm, steady voice rang again and again in his head. You chose corruption over duty. And now you must face the consequences. He sat down at his desk in the station, but the atmosphere felt different. The usual chatter among officers now seemed distant. Some glanced at him with curiosity, others with suspicion. It was as though everyone already knew something was wrong. Daniels avoided their eyes, shuffling papers he couldn't even read. The captain stepped out of his office, his face stern. His gaze lingered on Daniels for a moment before turning away. That short glance was enough. It carried disappointment, a silent judgment that stung worse than words. Daniels leaned back in his chair, trying to catch his breath. He told himself it wasn't over, that maybe he could explain, maybe he could smooth things over. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't something he could charm his way out of. The evidence was too strong. And Claire wasn't someone who could be intimidated into silence. That evening, as he drove home, every flashing light on the road made him nervous. Every siren in the distance sounded like it was meant for him. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his palms sweaty. For the first time, the streets he once patrolled with confidence now felt hostile. When he reached his apartment, he locked the door and sank into the couch. The silence of the room was unbearable. His thoughts raced. What if they dig deeper? What if they uncover other things? He remembered past complaints, moments when he had cut corners, times when he had used his badge for convenience. They had all been brushed aside before, but now, under federal eyes, they would resurface like buried ghosts. The next day at the station, whispers grew louder. A fellow officer who used to share jokes with him now avoided his gaze. Another gave him a polite nod but quickly walked away. The distance between him and his colleagues grew wider with every hour. It was as if they were already separating themselves, not wanting to be dragged down with him. At noon, he was summoned again, this time not to the conference room but to internal affairs. Two investigators sat across from him, their expressions serious. They asked him direct questions, one after another, about his conduct, his patrol records, and his previous complaints. Daniels tried to answer calmly, but his voice wavered. His usual confidence was gone. Every answer felt like stepping into quicksand. "Officer Daniels," one of them said firmly, "you need to understand that this is serious. The evidence against you is substantial. And with federal involvement, the department has no choice but to cooperate fully." Daniels nodded weakly, though inside, panic clawed at him. He could see his career slipping away, inch by inch. The badge he once polished with pride now felt like a burden pulling him down. That night, he sat alone in his apartment again, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His face looked older, more tired. The arrogant grin he once carried had vanished. All he saw was fear. He realized that for the first time, he had no control. He wasn't the one giving orders, he wasn't the one holding power, he was the one being watched, judged, and cornered. Meanwhile, Claire continued her work with quiet determination. She didn't celebrate or brag. She knew this was not about personal victory, it was about justice. She attended meetings, reviewed reports, and provided more details when needed. Her calmness stood in sharp contrast to Daniel's panic. Where he was unraveling, she was steady. The investigation widened. Federal agents began reviewing Daniel's connections. They looked into his friends, his off-duty activities, and even his financial records. Patterns started to emerge: late-night patrols that didn't match his reports, associations with people linked to local gangs, unexplained cash deposits in his bank account. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear, Daniels wasn't just an officer who had stepped out of line one night. He had been walking a dangerous path for a long time. And now, every step was being traced back to him. At the station, the atmosphere grew heavier. Daniels felt it every time he walked through the halls. Conversation stopped when he entered the room. Eyes followed him with quiet judgment. Some of his colleagues, who once laughed at his boldness, now avoided being seen with him. Loyalty faded quickly when trouble appeared. One afternoon, he tried to approach one of his closest colleagues, Officer Ramirez. "Come on, man," Daniels whispered. "You know me. You know I'm not as bad as they're making it sound." Ramirez sighed, shaking his head. "Daniels, I warned you before. I told you one day you'd push the wrong person. And now, look where you are." He turned away, leaving Daniels standing alone. That moment cut deeper than any official warning. It showed him that he was truly on his own. At home, his nights grew restless. He barely slept, tossing and turning with thoughts of hearings, suspensions, and prison walls. He replayed that night with Claire in his head over and over, wishing he had made a different choice. But it was too late. That one decision had opened a door he couldn't close. As days turned into weeks, Daniel's panic grew into desperation. He tried calling a lawyer, but even legal advice came with cold truths. "With the kind of evidence they have, you're facing serious consequences," the lawyer told him. Daniel slammed the phone down, his hands shaking. He wanted to believe there was still a way out, but reality pressed harder with each passing day. At the same time, Claire prepared herself for the next phase. She knew the case wasn't finished. The fallout had just begun. The evidence she provided had started a fire, and now the blaze was spreading. Soon, Daniels would face hearings not just inside his department but in courtrooms. And she would be there, steady and calm, representing truth. The once fearless officer was now a man drowning in fear. His pride had turned into panic, his confidence into trembling hands. Every sound of footsteps in the hallway made him wonder if they were coming for him. Every knock on the door made his heart leap. And though he still wore his uniform for the time being, deep down he knew the badge no longer protected him. The very system he had abused was now preparing to strip it away. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation into Officer Daniels reached its peak. The evidence gathered against him was more than enough to build a strong case. What had started as a single report from Claire had now expanded into a wide net of facts, records, and testimonies. His name, once spoken with respect in the precinct, was now whispered with caution and shame. Daniels was officially suspended. He turned in his badge and gun, handing them over with trembling hands. For a man who had built his entire identity on the weight of his uniform, the moment was crushing. He felt stripped not only of his job but of his very sense of self. The badge that once gave him authority now sat in a sealed envelope on a desk, no longer his to carry. His fellow officers didn't gather around him. No one offered a handshake or a farewell. The silence of the room spoke louder than any words. He walked out of the station with his head lowered, the sound of his boots echoing in a hallway that once felt like home but now felt like a cold reminder of his downfall. At the same time, Claire remained steady. She wasn't interested in watching him collapse, nor did she find joy in his misery. Her focus was on the principle behind it, the belief that authority must never be abused, and that justice must stand firm. She had done her part not out of revenge but out of duty. The case moved to court. Daniels sat at the defendant's table, his once confident posture now slouched. He avoided the eyes of the people in the room, ashamed of what he had become. His lawyer spoke for him, but even the lawyer's voice carried no real strength. The facts were too clear, the evidence too undeniable. When Claire entered the courtroom to testify, all eyes turned to her. She walked with quiet confidence, her steps calm and her head held high. She wore no uniform, no badge on display, yet her presence commanded respect. She took the stand, placed her hand on the oath, and spoke with clarity. She recounted the night in detail, the flashing lights, the officer's tone, the way he had spoken, and how she had quietly recorded every word. She presented the audio, and once again, Daniel's own voice filled the room, echoing like a ghost from his past. The jury listened intently. Some shook their heads, others took notes, but all of them heard the truth. Claire's testimony was not emotional or exaggerated. It was simple, direct, and powerful. She was not there to dramatize, she was there to tell the truth. Daniel sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the table. Each word she spoke cut deeper into his heart. He wanted to look away, to cover his ears, but he couldn't. The truth was inescapable. When the questioning was over, Claire stepped down from the stand with the same calmness she had walked in with. She returned to her seat, her face composed. For her, the case was not about defeating Daniels, it was about proving that no one was above accountability. The trial moved quickly. Other witnesses spoke, records were reviewed, and the federal investigators presented the findings of their wider probe. Daniels' past complaints, which had once been brushed aside, now returned with force. Patterns were revealed, showing that his misconduct was not a single mistake but part of a larger behavior. The jury reached its decision faster than expected. The foreman stood and spoke the words that sealed Daniel's fate. He was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of authority. Sentencing would follow, but the verdict itself was enough to close the chapter on his career. Daniels lowered his head, his hands covering his face. He felt the weight of everything collapse at once: the badge, the respect, the pride, the life he had built on false strength. Now it was all gone. In the days that followed, news of the case spread. Local papers reported on the story, highlighting how a single act of courage had exposed corruption inside the system. Community members, once silent, began to speak out about their own experiences with unfair treatment. Claire's actions had sparked more than justice for herself, it had opened a door for others to be heard. For Claire, life returned to its steady rhythm. She continued her work with the CIA, handling new cases and missions with the same calm professionalism. But something inside her had grown stronger. She had proven, once again, that silence is never the answer when faced with abuse of power. Truth, no matter how quietly spoken, always carries weight. One evening, as she walked home, she passed by a small park where families gathered. Children played on swings, parents watched with smiles, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Claire paused for a moment, taking it all in. This was why she did what she did. This was why justice mattered, not for recognition or power, but to ensure that ordinary people could live their lives without fear. Daniels, meanwhile, adjusted to a new reality. He no longer wore a uniform, no longer carried authority. His name was spoken with shame, and his future was uncertain. The world he once controlled had slipped through his fingers. He had learned the hardest way possible that arrogance built on corruption can never last. Months later, during his time in prison, he often thought back to that night. He replayed it again and again, wishing he had made a different choice. But regrets couldn't change the truth. The lesson was carved into his life forever. The story ended not with revenge, but with justice. Claire stood as a symbol of strength, not because she had fought with anger, but because she had stood calmly, firmly, with truth as her weapon. Daniels became the example of what happens when power is misused.